This podcast is a production of the Cable Podcast Network.
In the pines, where the sun never shines, you'll shiver when the cold wind blows. There's a grave in the pines where the sun never shines. There's a grave that's shaded with the pines.
If you're listening to us, then
You're alive. If you're not listening to us, you're probably dead.
We want to thank everybody who has been listening. We are getting requests and our listening audience is growing, so we appreciate everybody who's continually tuning in and listening to us ramble on about the past and things we were never involved in.
We have 23% of our listeners are from France. Yeah. So I'm not very good at French, but we'll
parlez-vous français.
Hey, parlez-vous français. Bonjour.
Yeah, and we appreciate everybody who has been listening, especially those that are outside of Kentucky. Honestly, we are very shocked and surprised by how many people are taking interest to this podcast that aren't in Kentucky, and we appreciate everybody. So keep on listening.
And you know, the interesting thing, Jameson, is about that history is connected to everything else. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's one of the things you learn is that everything is connected to everything else. Yeah. Just like in nature, in the universe. Yeah. You know? And so if you're in Montana, somehow Kentucky history relates to you.
Yeah. And when you think of, too, if you want to get very technical
that's what we're
here,
supposed to do.
The Native Americans that were in Kentucky, we'll get into that eventually, where they were forced to move west. That's right. And a lot of the Native Americans ended up in the west, originated in the east, in Kentucky.
This podcast is actually about that. It's the roots of that. It's about moving the Shawnee Indians out of their territory and the man who stood in the way to resist it.
All right, so we've been talking about Daniel Boone. We've talked about Simon Kenton, and we've talked a little bit about Simon Girty as well. But now, as we mentioned in the last podcast, history is all about perspective.
That's right.
So what perspective do we have today?
We have the perspective of a Native American chief, one of the most interesting ones in American history, by the name of Tecumseh. And that's really exciting. He is one of my favorite characters of American history. Or of all history, period, anywhere. Mm-hmm. He was a man that superseded everyone else. He was an incredible person. And, there's so many ways. We have just such a short amount of time to talk about him. And what angle do we want? We would talk about his bravery or his fighting or his intelligence and all that. He had something that practically no other human being had or has had. He was clairvoyant. Oh, wow. He knew what was going to happen before it happened. Yeah. And that is something very rare. When I think of people in history, I know people that have visions and who can think about, their ideas for the future and project those. I can't hardly think of anyone throughout all of history, unless, maybe you include Jesus Christ, that actually knew, the destiny of what things were going to be for certain and could see it. A visionary who could see it. So you've got this Shawnee who grows up and becomes a chief, and he knows what's going to happen almost all the time. Yeah. And he predicts it. And he uses that tool to unite the Indians. Yeah. Now, if you just look at Tecumseh as an Indian chief, major chief of the Shawnee, you say, you read the history books, and they'll define him as the leader who had this vision to unite all the Indians west of the Allegheny Mountains. To unite against a common enemy, which were the Americans. Yeah. And he, in doing so, in order to provide him with weapons and forces and so forth, he sided with the British. And we've already said in Kentucky history that Kentuckians in their forts were fighting the British, both in the Revolutionary War and in the War of 1812. That's what it looked like. Yeah. And Tecumseh becomes a spearhead, and he tries to get all these tribes who have for thousands and thousands of years just fought amongst themselves over land and territory. Yeah. And he sees this huge invasion of Europeans moving into his sacred land and grounds. And he sees them making treaties and then violating the treaties and making another treaty and just gradually taking his land. Yeah. And he just goes bananas. He just can't handle it. Yeah. And so that's how he comes to be. I'm going to read several passages once again from the Frontiersmen by Alan W. Eckert. And I want to just start with his birth.
Sounds good.
And, you know, from the very beginning, there were like mystical things happening. And that's what makes it so cool. Like when he's born in Chillicothe, Ohio, March the 9th, 1768. He born under the sign of shooting stars just explode in the sky at the moment of his birth.
Wow.
And all the Indians witness it and record it in history. And this is Alan W. Eckert's take on it. His father is praying outside the probably longhouse hut where his wife is getting ready to deliver a baby, and there's women sitting around the fire. He's wanting to find the right words to Manito, which is their god. He raised his eyes skyward, but the prayer died, aborting as a huge meteor suddenly plunged into the atmosphere and burst into brilliant greenish-white flame. It streaked across the heavens from the north in an awe-inspiring spectacle, which lasted fully 20 seconds. Pumpkinshaw had heard of such occurrences, but not before had he ever seen anything so breathtaking as this, and the tales of the old people came back to him now. So it goes on, it says, from within the temporary shelter came the sharp wail of a baby. And so it goes on. So his baby boy is born, and he says, a Shawnee custom declares that a boy baby is not named for 10 days after his birth, nor a girl for 12, during which time an unsuma, a notable event, would occur which should indicate what Manito wished the child to be called. But this time the sign had been given at the very moment of birth, and this was of great importance. Both Pumpkinshaw and Methotassah knew there could be no other name for this boy than the panther passing across. Thus was born and named the Shawnee Indian known as Tecumseh.
Wow. So he was named. So the tradition was for them to wait 10 days before
That's
the name.
right. For a boy, 12 days for a girl.
But in this scenario, they named him instantly just from the signs.
That's right.
That's
it just blew him away.
Yeah.
And the stars just exploded in the sky. And, it's like the star was like a panther that races across the star every night, the sky, and finds a place to sleep. So Tecumseh grows up, and there was an event that happened that there was a treaty signed, and they're living near Chillicothe, Ohio, somewhere in that region. That's where the major principal Shawnee village is. There were some whites that crossed the Ohio River into what is now Ohio, into this area. Tecumseh's father and a few braves went to confront them, saying, this is our land, and they killed his father.
Oh, okay.
So this kind of formed a little bit of an impression on his life, and he loved his father. So as custom in a tribal community, he's raised by his uncle. And his uncle and everybody sees that this boy is special from day one.
Yeah.
Okay? And so he teaches him everything he possibly can.
Yes.
To be as great as he can. When Tecumseh is 8 years old, here's another, just a physical description of him. It said, for an 8-year-old, Tecumseh was unusually tall. He stood very erect and was a remarkably intelligent and good-looking youngster. His abilities were apparent in whatever he found it important to excel. He reveled in the games and sports engaged in with his many companions at Chillicothe, and listened carefully to the lessons received from his brother Chikaska and others who taught him. More than a few times Chief Blackfish had eyed him approvingly and thought how proud of his son Pumpkinshaw would have been. And it goes on and talks about his life. And one thing about Tecumseh that was different than the other Indians, there were many things, is that he was very morally correct. As a 12-year-old, he went into Blackfish Lodge with the elders where they had burned a white man at the stake. He goes, this isn't what Shawnee people do that are great warriors.
Yeah.
You don't tie a person to a stake and murder him. And he said, shame on you.
Wow.
He shamed his elders at 12 years old. And he just said, if I'm ever chief, this is never going to happen again under my watch.
Wow.
And he just did things like that. He was very ethical. If he played sports, it wasn't like, well, I'm going to win at any cost. He was like caring for other people, caring for nature. He felt that was his God. He was just a super human being. Tecumseh goes ahead and, he lives his life, and he does a lot of things, and he ties in with the British, and he tries to get other tribes to denounce these treaties that Tecumseh, there would be one tribe that would make a treaty and give up land that belonged to another tribe, just to get their favor, to get them off their back. And Tecumseh was saying this was all wrong, and this land that his ancestors were buried in, the burial grounds, some of the chiefs had ceded that land to the white people where they could hunt. In land that his father had died for, trying to protect, legally, according to the white man's law. So he was really upset about it. And he began to see things like, we're all brothers. We're all Native Americans. And why can't all these tribes unite against a common foe instead of dividing up and fighting amongst themselves? So this was his thought. You'd think this would be a thought they would have. But we look at they're Indians. We lump them all the same. But they're as different as French are from German or English are from Spanish. They're just totally different. They look different. They're physically different. They have similarities, but they also have things that aren't similar, and they control certain areas of land. Yeah. And they've been fighting for land and resources
for hundreds of years.
And this is the same thing that's going on from Europe. We've said it before, but it's good to get the big perspective when you look at history. What are these white people doing in North America?
Yeah.
Europe had totally exhausted their resources. There was no more wild game. There were no more trees. They had just raped the land, and huge populations of people starving, disease, plague. And so they come to North America. Yeah. And here is just like, in the whole world, this is like Nirvana. It's like great forests, animals, fish, utopia. And so what do? They come and they rape it. That's basically what they do. They set up colonies, and the definition of a colony is you take the resources of your area and you send it back to your mother country. Yeah. Whether it's English colonies, Spanish colonies, French colonies, they're all here for the resources. And so here are these Indians, the natives that are living here. We're talking about perspective now. Yeah. And they're just trying to guard what's theirs and protect it, or they'll die and starve. Yeah. They depend on it for their food source. So here we go. So Tecumseh, this clairvoyant person, when he's in battle, like when he's 14 years old or 13 years old, he goes into his first battle and he kills 8 people. And his favorite weapon is a war club against people with long rifles. Yeah. So you can just imagine how, he just runs and, right into the face of fire and, no fear at all. Yeah. And just bashes people. There were times when he was in battle and there would be a man hiding behind a tree. A big tree, let's say, and he would know the moment that man would step out behind the tree, and he would aim his gun to that spot, and the man would step right into it and he'd shoot him. Wow! Because he knew what the man was going to do. It wasn't like every once in a while he has this vision. Oh yeah. I can go on and on about Tecumseh, but it's like he has this brother that's named the Prophet, and he's jealous of Tecumseh, and he wants his power, and Tecumseh loves his brother, so he tells him some things that's going to happen, and this guy becomes known as the Prophet. He's a medicine man, but he's an alcoholic, and it's not good. Yeah. And he's really just a waste, and he just, he wants power. He just starves for power. So he gets his brother to kind of help him to say certain things are going to happen, so they believe it's him. So anyway, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but while Tecumseh's away, the prophet says that he's got this vision that if they all attack right now, that they'll be victorious. And of course they're not. He doesn't have that vision. He lied, and the Indians get slaughtered. But anyway, Tecumseh, and this to me is the most interesting thing about Tecumseh's life that I'm getting ready to tell you about. And this is incredible. He goes to all these tribes, travels all over North, New York. So he goes into the South and he visits all these tribes. I think it takes him years. And he meets with them unafraid and says, listen, you're my brother. We need to work together, da-da-da-da-da. He said, the Great Spirit is with me. And he says, I'm going to give you a bundle of sticks. Yeah. Okay. And he gives him a bundle of these twigs. And he says, every moon or something, I want you to take one stick from this pile. And when you're out of sticks, something great is going to happen. And this is what he says, as the great sign is going to happen. Yeah. He tells them. And this is from the frontiersmen again. This great sign that Tecumseh spoke of, or wherever he went, always remained the same, and his telling of it never failed to awe his audience. When the period of waiting was over, he told them when tribal unification had been completed, when all was in readiness, then would this sign be given. In the midst of night, the earth beneath would tremble and roar for a long period. Jugs would break, though there would be no one near to touch them. Great trees would fall, though the air be windless. Streams would change their course to run backwards, and lakes would be swallowed up into the earth, and other lakes suddenly appear. The bones of every man would tremble, and with the trembling of the ground, and they would not mistake it. No, there was not anything to compare with it in their lives, nor in the lives of their fathers or their fathers before them since time began. When this time came, they were to drop their mattocks and flesh scrapers, leave their fields and their hunting camps and their villages, and join together and move to assembled areas, the Lake River from the fort of Detroit. And on that day, they would no longer be Mohawks or Senecas, Oneidas or Onondagas, or any other tribe. They would be Indians, one people united forever, where the good of one would henceforth become the good of all. So it would be.
Wow.
That's what he told them. Now, that's pretty heavy. He also told them that day would become night and night would become day at the same time. He said the day would be dark, like night. And we're going to find out what happens in just a minute. Hang on to your bootstraps, man. What it was, he predicted the great earthquake of 1811 that formed Reelfoot Lake and so forth. The rivers did run backwards, and all these things actually happened just like he said it was going to happen.
Okay, well, that was my question was, did it happen?
It happened. It happened just to the detail that he said. Frontier cabins in Kentucky, their chimneys broke apart and fell. So if you look at a house that was maybe built in the 1790s or early 1800s before 1811, you look at the chimney and it's probably been rebuilt because of Tecumseh's prophecy.
Wow.
And the great St. Andrew's Fault that lies along the Mississippi River, that's what this was. And they're predicting we're going to get one again.
Oh, wow.
And the geologists say it's going to all happen again, that was a St. Andrew's Fault is huge, and it's just ready to happen. Geologists say anytime we can experience it. So
good thing I got an earthquake insurance.
Yeah, get your earthquake. Sign up. Go to State Farm, and they will sell you some. Happen. So we jump a little further ahead. On December the 16th, 1811, it was a Monday, at 2:30 in the morning, the earth began to shake, according to Alan W. Eckert. In the south of Canada, in the villages of the Iroquois, Ottawa, Chippewa, and Huron, it came as a deep, terrifying rumble. Creek banks caved in, and huge trees toppled in a continuous crash of snapping branches. In all the Great Lakes, but especially Lake Michigan and Lake Erie, the waters danced and the great waves broke erratically on the shores, though there was no wind. In the western plains, there was a fierce grinding sound and a shuddering, which jarred the bones and set teeth on edge. Earthen vessels split apart, and great herds of bison staggered to their feet and stampeded in abject panic. To the south and west, tremendous boulders broke loose on hills and cut swaths through the trees and brush to the bottoms. Rapidly rushing streams stopped and eddied, and some of them abruptly went dry, and the fish that had lived in them flopped away their lives on the muddy or rocky beds. To the south, whole forests fell in incredible tangles. New streams sprang up where none had been before. In the upper creek village of Tuckatachi, every dwelling shuddered and shook and then collapsed upon itself and its inhabitants. To the south and east, palm trees lashed about like whips, and lakes emptied of their waters, while ponds appeared in huge declivities, which suddenly dented the surface of the earth. All over the land, birds were roused from their roosting places with screams of fright and flapping wings. Cattle bellowed and kicked, lost their footing, and were thrown to the ground, where they rolled about, unable to regain their balance. In Kentucky and Tennessee and the Indian Territory, settlers were thrown from their beds and heard the timbers of their cabins wrench apart and watched the bricks crumble into heaps of debris, masked in choking clouds of dust. Bridges snapped and timbered into rivers and creeks. Glass shuddered, fences and barns collapsed, and fires broke out. Along steep ravines, the cliffside slipped and filled with their chasms, and the country was blanketed with a deafening roar. And it goes on, it says, in the center of all this, the Ohio River meets the Mississippi, where Tennessee and Kentucky, Arkansas and Missouri and Illinois come together. Fantastic splits appeared in the ground, and huge tracts of land were swallowed up. A few miles from the Mississippi, near the Kentucky-Tennessee border, a monstrous section of ground sank as if some gigantic foot had stepped on the soft earth and mashed it down. Water gushed forth in fantastic volume, and the depression became filled and turned into a large lake, to be known as Reelfoot Lake today. The whole midsection of the Mississippi wreathed and heaved, and tremendous bluffs toppled into the muddy waters. Such was the great sign of Tecumseh.
Pretty amazing.
Pretty amazing, isn't it? And that's,
Yeah.
you'd think this is fiction.
Oh, yeah,
It's
yeah.
not. It's not. This happens. This is recorded geologically that these things happen. And Tecumseh talked about it a year before it happened, and even knew the moment that it was going to happen.
And with no, just intuition, I guess, or just that clairvoyancy, as you said, would be the only thing we could account it to.
Yeah. Tecumseh's federation, fought the United States during what they call the Tecumseh War, but he was unsuccessful in getting the U.S. government to rescind the Treaty of Fort Wayne, which gave a lot of land, cession treaties, and he, in 1811, he traveled south to the Cherokees and tried to get more and more. He defended Prophetstown against William Henry Harrison's army in the Battle of Tippecanoe. The Native Americans retreated from the field, and European Americans unearthed graves and burned Prophetstown. He was the leader of this group. They continued to fight the United States after forming an alliance. Remember, the United States had been formed. This was after the Revolutionary War, and with Great Britain in the War of 1812. That's the one, that started in the, "Oh, say can you see," Psalms and all that, and they burned Washington and all that stuff. But again, the British were using the Indian allies, and the Indians hoped that the British would remember that. They took Fort Detroit, and they say Tecumseh was, famous for that. Another thing, he was made the general. He was the only chief that was made general of British Army.
Wow!
They gave him the rank of general in the British Army. And I think at some point he gave it back to him, and he said it didn't mean anything to him. He was an Indian, and he didn't like being a general, of their army.
He wasn't British anyway.
The thing that's also really interesting that goes along with this theme we're talking about today is when he died at the Battle of Thames on October the 5th, 1813. His death and the end of the war broke up the alliance. But in the battle, they had fought one day, I think, and he gathered all of his tribe around, and he said, "Tomorrow I'm going to die."
Oh, wow.
And he said that if you'll take the ramrod of my gun, and he said they're going to shoot me right at the beginning of the battle. It's going to shoot me like right in the head, and I'm going to die. And he said, but if you will take the ramrod out of my gun and tap me 3 times with it, and don't be afraid and continue to attack, you will be victorious and win the battle. He said, if you try to worry about me and take me back, you'll all be defeated. And when he did just as he said, he walked right out, led the tribe against the attack, and practically the first shot killed him. And they panicked. They panicked because they just couldn't believe it. He gave away all of his worldly things that night, like had earrings, and he gave them away, and bracelets. Only he kept was his famous war club. Gave his rifle away, everything material in the world. He gave it to his friends the night before. He only had his war club and his naked body when he went into battle. They tapped him with the rod 3 times. I don't know if it was a rod of his gun or somebody else's, but they didn't do that. They grabbed his body up, and they were all defeated. They were in such grief and so forth but they tried to get his body, but they all just ran in panic. And that was when, dovetailing with Simon Kenton, he saw Tecumseh's body and respected it and told him it was another chief because Tecumseh looked so plain and wasn't dressed like a chief too, because he'd given everything away. But Simon Kenton recognized him, and they allowed them to come back and get their body, and they mutilated the body of another chief, who was dressed like a chief. I mean, Simon Kenton saw that.
That's a very good way for those two stories to connect, because that would make more sense that he'd already given all this stuff away, so he didn't look as if he was a chief.
But he's just pure, interesting character, and it's just hard for me to fathom. This sounds like a fairy tale, but it's really backed up by a lot of historical legend and study, and even the prophecy of the earthquake and so forth that took place. And it was an eclipse of the sun and the moon that also happened. And that's what led night into day, and and everyone felt it and everyone knew it, and he predicted the exact moment that it would happen, which was just unbelievable. The battle of that he died in was actually in Canada, across the lakes from the Great Lakes, and that's where he was killed. As we've seen a lot of the Native American, we saw Simon Girty retreat to Canada, after the War of 1812, but Tecumseh was killed in it.
And just to add to our discussion of, I don't want to say characters, but historical people, we talked about Boone and the Siege of Boonesboro. We talked about Simon Kenton and him running the gauntlet and Simon Girty come in to rescue him in a way. And now we have Tecumseh, who was able to predict all these things that happened. And as you were saying, and they all sound so much like fairy tales and these wild fantasy stories, but yet those things do happen, and that's probably where people get these stories from. You look at fantasy stories you may see today or in the past. These things that had happened are what's forming people's, not to say imagination, but their stories.
Yeah.
And which history, as in time goes, becomes stories and legend and myths and so forth.
That's right. I hope that I see it as I talk about it, and I think you do too, and I hope our listeners do, see how all these are related. The lives are just kind of intertwined. Boone, Kenton, Tecumseh, Girty, Fort Herod, James Herod, Logan Fort here in Stanford. All of them are just kind of all these people are, affecting each other's lives, and they're all kind of dovetailed together. Both Boone and Kenton fought against Tecumseh at one time or another. And,
wow.
They were well aware of him.
Well, it's one thing to earn respect.
Kenton was kind of scared to death of him. I mean, he fought him and almost killed him one time in a surprise attack. But Tecumseh, they had Tecumseh and his men totally surrounded in southern Ohio. And it was like morning when they were waking up.
Yeah.
And they were in these like little shelters. There were maybe 15 or 20 Indians with Tecumseh. And they just started shooting into the tents or whatever. And instead of everyone panicking and running, Tecumseh gathered up all his men, and they went right after the people in the ambush and killed more of them than they killed of the Indians. I mean, he was just a fierce leader. He didn't run. Yeah. And he probably knew that if they do that, that's just what they wanted to do, was them to panic. But he didn't. He ordered his braves to just, wherever they're shooting from, just charge them, go after them, and, drive them out. And Kenton said, when this happened, he was saying he knew that he was up against a mighty leader and wanted to get the heck out of there, because he said he was next in line to get his head bashed in. That's the way he told about it. He said, man, we've met somebody that's not like any other foe we've ever met. This guy is something else. Kenton recognized that.
And you think about Kenton and Tecumseh in this matter, it's one thing to earn respect among your peers, but to earn respect among your enemies is even a bigger attribute.
Absolutely.
And Tecumseh, for sure, was one, but on the other hand, so was Kenton. Whenever he did the gauntlet 9 times with the Native Americans, and he earned a lot of respect from them as well. Again, these people, these big historical kind of figures, connecting in many ways.
And that's what's so fun about history is that it's like a puzzle, and when you put all the pieces together, you begin to see it so clearly. That's what I get so excited about history. Is because, just barely, my mental facilities are pretty low, faculties. But when I do put things together, though, it's like, wow, that really works. I can see how that would be. And then if you study it so much, you kind of get good at it. And you understand cause and effect relationships. And, this caused this to happen, and this caused that. And if you do this, and if you do that, and, it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, and I hope, too, that people that are listening are appreciating more of the detail that we're getting into, because we've all had 5th grade history, but yet have we got to this point, to this deep of knowledge of the people intertwining, more people that maybe you didn't even realize were a piece of the puzzle.
It's true. It's true. Some of the quotes from Tecumseh, and these won't surprise you when you hear them. He said, show respect to all people, but grovel to none. A single twig breaks, but the bundle of twigs is strong. Think about Kentucky's motto, united we stand, divided we fall. Sell a country, why? Why not sell the air? Why not sell the clouds and the great sea, as well as the earth? Did not the Great Spirit make them all for the use of his children? So he couldn't understand the sale of land. He goes, why don't you sell the clouds up there, man? Why don't you sell the trees or the air that we breathe? I mean, he just couldn't fathom that. He said, this is God's, territory. You can't sell God. The Spirit is within all of nature. How can you sell the Spirit of God?
Yeah.
Because you people are crazy, man.
That's very insightful.
My most interesting. Simon Kenton as a white man and Tecumseh the other, and it's all formatted in this book, The Frontiersmen, as well as a series of Gateway to Empire and Wilderness Empire and so forth that Eckert wrote. Pretty good stuff. So on this rainy day in Kentucky, as I look out the windows here at Crab Orchard Elementary School and the playground out back and the kids, the rain's pouring down and winter's coming on, and Think back on what it was like back in the frontier day when the Indians roamed these woods and the frontiersmen. I'm sure Boone and Kenton went right through this land we're looking at out your window here. The Wilderness Road is only about 100 yards from here.
Yep.
It's really interesting. I love it. And Kentucky comes to life with its history. It really does.
Which, wherever you are listening to this, it may or may not be raining, but...
It's raining here, by God. If I say it's raining, it's raining.
Again, so let's...
This is Kentucky.
Yeah, if you stick around, the weather will change.
Yes, it will. Change to snow.
Let's map out our road here.
Our Wilderness Road.
Where's our next stop?
Where's our next stop?
We going to some forts? Or some founders?
We could.
Yeah,
we could go to some of the forts. We've talked about Fort Herod some and Boonesboro, but we haven't talked about Logan or Bryan Station, and about the women who went for water while the Indians surrounded the fort and pretended like they weren't there, the bravery of the woman on the frontier. There's a lot of things we can talk about there. And then, like we said, we want to go on. I want to talk a little bit about the golden age of agriculture and what agriculture meant to Kentucky in the early days. And that leads us into slavery, which is bad news. Kentucky's position on that, and then, of course, the Civil War that was really fought to free the slaves.
Yeah. All right. So that sounds pretty good.
Thank you for taking the time to record this. I enjoy the podcast myself and the music that you put with them and all. It's I enjoy listening to myself.
Well, it's a lot of fun. I enjoy listening and putting it together and then listening to it again and taking out all the crazy things we say. So we'll make some stops. Well, I would think it would be very interesting because at the time frame of, say, Fort Logan, Fort Boonesboro, Fort Herod, and so on, and like Bryan Station and those sorts of areas, and we could do a podcast on each one, or just lump it all together.
Lump them.
However we want to, or however you feel. Lump them together. Sounds good.
I'm going to take my dog and go squirrel hunting right now. So even in the rain, I don't care.
Yes.
So lump them.
All right.
That sounds like a Kentucky term.
Yeah,
lump them, man. Lump them.
So if you have any suggestions or you want to help us steer the ship here, let us know. You can, again, connect to us, comment on Facebook. You can join the Cable Podcast Network group.
Try to keep it clean.
Yeah, keep it clean.
No rotten tomatoes.
Okay, all right. Or you can tweet us at Cable Podcast.
For you in France, au revoir.
Yeah. Please connect to us if you're in France. Let us know who you are.
Yeah.
But anyway.
That's a quarter of all that's listening to us, That tells you something right there.
I am surprised, though. I don't know how that it has got to France.
23%.
But 23%, are listening in France. So,
from the backwoods of Kentucky.
Yes.
Amazing.
Yeah, so
wow.
We're connecting, and help us spread out, too. Help us spread as much as you can.
Go to Germany.
Share it with your friends on Facebook and let them know. All right, the more we grow, I guess, the better, and the more in depth we can get. So,
more we'll understand ourselves by understanding history.
There you go. All right, with that being said,
toodaloo.
See you later.
Au revoir.
Au revoir. We would like to thank all of our listeners out there who support the show by listening to each and every episode. We couldn't do it without you. From all across the U.S., we thank you for the support. If you would like to join the conversation and give your thoughts on this podcast and other episodes, join the Cable Podcast Network group on Facebook. If you are enjoying the content of this podcast, consider visiting anchor.fm/themeadows, KYhistory/support. You can also find this link in the show's description, or check out the Cable Podcast Network Patreon page. If you want to help this podcast grow in other ways, like the Cable Podcast Network page on Facebook and share our links on all social media outlets. You can find the Cable Podcast Network on Facebook, Tumblr, and Twitter. If you're listening to this podcast on iTunes, give us a positive review and leave a comment. Thanks again for all your support.